I just feel like a lot of psychiatrists, they rely on people remaining unwell or they don't have a career. I remember not that long ago, probably 6 or 8 years ago, I had quite a nice psychiatrist as an inpatient and I really wanted to go for a walk. I just wanted to walk around the block and he said, okay, I'll let you go because there's been this new research that if you go walking, it helps your mental health. Like, I knew that 20 years ago. How come you only just know that now? Like,
Sue, thank you for joining us today on the Lived Experience. And you reached out to me, wanted to share your story, which is fantastic. I think you reached out via the website. And what made you want to reach out and share your story in the podcast?
So I've been listening to your podcasts for a while, and I've just noticed there are a lot of things that were very similar in actually with your story, with your mum and dad, with my own story. And also most recently, I listened to one about, I can't remember her name, a young lady who was bipolar and didn't take medication anymore.
Missy, yeah.
Yeah, and I felt like, for a long time, I felt like I was the only person that was managing on either very minimal medication or no medication at times and doing okay. I had made a lot of changes, like she also did in my life, to make that happen. And I guess I just wanted to talk about that, but also focus on how I got mental illness and how there's a link between childhood trauma as well.
Let's get into it, and thanks for reaching out and sharing. It's very brave of you to do, and I'm glad that you got something out of Missy's episode where she shared that. It was a really good discussion to listen to her. So yeah, let's get into it. So wherever you want to start, please go.
Yeah, sure. So I'll probably start on a brief overview of the dynamics that I grew up in. So I pretty much suffered from birth. I was separated from my mother for about 2 weeks, like a lot of parents are. But my mother wanted a boy. She didn't want a girl. And she told me years later that she feels like she went straight into postnatal depression. But this was in 1970s, so there wasn't any help for women back then with postnatal depression, and she remained quite depressed. And the dynamics of our family, I have an older sister. She's approximately 5 years older than me. My mum really wanted a girl and then a boy, and she got a girl and another girl. So I was kind of dressed as a boy for a long time, growing up as not thinking I was a boy, but just accepting that I was going to get boy toys and people were going to think I was a boy because I had a very boyish haircut, all that kind of stuff. From about 8 years of age, my mother was a chronic alcoholic. She was in a domestically abusive relationship. Now, it was subtle. It was financial abuse. It was that kind of thing. She wasn't allowed to work. And they were complete opposites. She was very quiet. She suffered from depression throughout her life, and she was an alcoholic, and he was very outgoing and was never at home. So that was the dynamic that I grew up in. My sister left when I was about 11, and then it was like being an only child, really. I ended up with, the other thing too during my life was that I couldn't do maths. And back then, if you couldn't do maths, you were looked at as not intelligent, and my family just thought I was just not very bright. Quite early on, they bought me a digital clock because I couldn't work out analog, and none of this was really put into place. I couldn't read timetables. I couldn't do maths at all. The things that my own children talked to me about as they went through BC, I had no idea what they're talking about. And so it wasn't until I was in my early 50s, I had a neuropsych report done and I was diagnosed as dyscalculia. So that's on the neurodivergent spectrum, which explained a lot about me. I don't have very good filters either. And there's a certain amount of anxiety when you get into a train station, you can't read the numbers or the timetables. So that was the dynamic as well. So essentially when I was 12 years old, otherwise my childhood, there was a lot of alcoholic parents around and I thought it was all just normal. I didn't really pick up on the domestic abuse as much until I was older. But when I was just started high school, I experienced an episode. I was 12, turning 13, and I experienced an episode of sexual abuse involving 3 males. And from that time, everything changed for me. So I was a pretty naive child. I was just, cruising along, doing the best I could and trying to enjoy life, and very young at heart. And overnight that changed. So I was expelled from school. I started chroming and stopped substance abusing, and I continued to chrome for a couple of years. I changed schools and continued to chrome, and then I ended up often passing out in the toilets, and they'd take me out the office and I ended up in hospital. And so while I was in that hospital, they suggested I went to a psychiatrist and a private psychiatric hospital, which ended up being a pretty notorious place. It wasn't owned by Anne Hamilton Byrne, a coal leader of the family, but most of the nurses there and some of the psychiatrists were all in that cult, which was called The Family. So I went into there 3 times. I had 3 admissions. And while I was in there, I had another episode of sexual abuse where I was removed from the hospital. And then I went back to substance abusing in the hospital and was transferred to Larundel, which was, I don't know if you've heard of Larundel. It's an adult acute ward for people back in the 70s, 80s. I think maybe it shut in early 90s. But it was one of those really...
States, sorry?
It's in Victoria, in Bundoora.
Okay, right.
Yeah, I think Latrobe Uni's there now. So it was one of the most heavy. It was joined with Mont Park. It was massive. I was in an adult acute ward. I was sectioned. By then I was 14. I had been sectioned. My parents couldn't get me out. I don't think they knew I was in there for a little while. And I experienced really severe sexual abuse there. I was secluded. I was put in a seclusion and experienced really heavy sexual abuse and a lot of things that just wouldn't be done these days. So after that, that was the first time I attempted to take my life. I was taken back to the private hospital and I tried to take my life in there. And from then on, things changed quite dramatically for me. I kind of put up a block as to all the sexual abuse that had happened, and my parents, they ended up buying me a dog, and that changed my life. So I didn't feel like I had been by then sexually abused by male and female, and I didn't feel like I could trust anybody. So I had this whole kind of change. I ended up getting an eating disorder. I didn't have suicidality at that time anymore because I had something to look after. I went to dog training. I became a dog trainer when I was about between 16 and 18. And that gave me sort of a sense of purpose. So again, look, the psychiatrist that I saw at the time, I say he got me addicted to Seropax, but he gave me so many, which is like Valium. It's a benzodiazepine. At the time, I don't think they have Seropax now. And I ended up in a state of almost taking a packet a day. So I didn't want to die anymore, but I was still stuck in addiction. I had an eating disorder and I was stuck in a really bad place. I didn't go back to school from 14 onwards. My parents didn't really know what to do. And so I decided I was just going to come off them. I don't advise this. I decided I would come off them cold turkey, which is what I did. I just stopped them and I had all the things they said that I would have. I had fits, all sorts of things. My parents kept leaving the house because they didn't want to deal with it. And I kind of got better in a way of my mind just shut down from all the abuse. I didn't think about it any longer. So I was able to function. I got a job and I had these things kind of going through my life of periodic eating disorders and started in my early 20s to have really major depressions. But I also had hypomania. When you don't want to deal with the medical system because you haven't had a good experience, you are never going to go to a doctor and say, I have heightened sexuality. I feel really good. I feel on top of the world. I think I can solve everything. And so I was always just diagnosed with depression, put on antidepressants, and I would elevate. So I just went through this cycle of that happening for quite a while so I got married, I moved regionally and had 3 sons, all 3 years apart, and they're now young adults. And the first 2 I had serious depressions, and then the third one I had quite elevated hypomania. And that's when they said, look, we think you've got bipolar. And I thought, well, I think I've had it for a while, but okay, yeah. So that was kind of my story of my mental health history. It was up and down. I had periods where the eating disorder, and that was presented as anorexia, would come back into my life. So when I was 35, I was pregnant with my last son and I went into quite significant anorexia because probably 12 months prior, my mum had attempted to take her life. And I won't say what she took, but she had a good crack. She was in ICU for a week. And then from then on, she died from the effects of her suicide attempt 18 months later. My dad pretty much put her in a home immediately afterwards. He was somebody that wanted to travel the world. He had retired. He didn't want to look after her. I had 3 very young children, a baby, and so I wasn't in a position to look after her. And my sister just said, I'm a career person. I'm not dealing with it, although she was really good at finding her a place and she was the closest to her. So she dealt with a lot of mum's stuff. So that was the situation that we're in. And then 12 months later, my mum died. So she had probably 2 weeks in palliative care in the nursing home that she was in, and she died. I feel like I made peace with her before she died. I forgave her for everything, and there was a lot. You don't see it when you're a child, but there was neglect. There was all this kind of stuff, and you don't find out about it until I'm in my 50s, and I'm now starting to FOI gather freedom of information records on child protection and that kind of thing that I had, or people had reported against my parents. Yeah, so that was that's stuff that, you know, you sometimes you don't deal with it until you're really quite a bit older, or you've had your own family and you look at your kids and think that wasn't okay, what happened. I also went through a period, I guess, from 13 to 16 where she had a lot of episodes under inebriated where she would hurt herself. And my dad would be overseas. My sister was a fair way away and I'd have to deal with it. So that was pretty heavy too. So I essentially left home. As soon as I turned 18, I had interaction with my father and he hit me in the face and I ended up with 2 black eyes. And I had to go to work the next day and I had to ring my boss and say, how are we going to explain this? I'm really anxious. And she said, well, just say you're playing, I think hockey or something, and you got hit in the nose, and that would have caused 2 black eyes. So back then we were hiding domestic abuse and making excuses. And then she did, to her credit, this person found me a place to stay within a week. And I moved out. I never, ever went back to stay a night at their place again. And I spent many years having no contact at all because of that. So that was my experience with having a parent with mental illness. And then I went into my own. I had 3 children myself, so I was mindful. I tried to be mindful, but I had bipolar, and I think I was maybe 40 when I was diagnosed with complex PTSD as well.
As you, yeah, understandable, 100% understandable.
Yeah, so that started my reporting to police on one of my perpetrators, which it made it so much worse, but it also made, because everything came back, because I had 3 episodes of abuse, I reported the middle episode and everything came back in my mind. They asked me things about Larundel, and then that abuse came back, and my prior history with the boys, that came back as well. And I couldn't kind of filter it and just focus on the one thing. The other thing too is when you go through the legal system, you are referred to as a victim constantly. And then you start to feel like a victim, and you didn't feel like a victim before. You didn't really think about it before. You just blocked it. But as I say, when my PTSD started, it started in the form of flashbacks, and they were so intense that I would disassociate immediately, and I was really struggling with it. I already had a diagnosis as I thought it was going insane. I was completely losing my mind and I wasn't going to get it back. So I thought the only way to do this is to report, and that person will be spoken to and they'll tell me why they took me out of a hospital and they abused me, and this will be sorted. And that's not what happened at all. I don't think perpetrators very often just get spoken to and say, yeah, I did that and I'm sorry. So that's what happened. Yeah.
Well, thank you for writing your notes and sharing all that. It must have been very, very powerful stuff. It's a lot obviously you've gone through with your story, and it's very hard to hear from me anyway, like the stuff you've gone through, because I understand my mum's story, a little bit of similarities, but also how you managed to, it's amazing how you managed to keep pushing forward with all that trauma, where a lot of people would experience a lot less and, might not push forward with it. So, it's amazing to hear how, you've got a family and you've managed to push forward with it. So my questions to you will be around, I want to get advice because you've gone through a lot of trauma, and I think trauma, a lot of people, I still think there's an attitude where they say, bad things happen to everyone and, get on with it, which I think is a really bad attitude to have. But I think we now know there's a lot of audiobooks and stuff people can listen to, the Gabriel Maté stuff and all this thing. Everything's pretty much based on trauma, your personality and a lot of things about you is started from, based on trauma. You mentioned the separation at birth, which is a quite important thing between the mother and the child when they're a baby even. Like, my mum was separated from my mum for 8 weeks due to something as well. And we think that's where sort of all the things started happening with the condition as well. So even from birth, you're on the back foot. Like, it's like, what I mean? It's amazing how much you've gone through, and just even from day one, that trauma. And that's a real thing. And I think if people listening to this podcast will sort of understand that, but people in the general public don't understand that, how important that is from day one between a mother and their new baby, and the effects it actually can have if there is an absence like you've had.
Yeah, well, I noticed it with my own children because I had 2 children that were placed in special care. Now, these days, back in the 70s, special care meant you just did not see that baby. So your milk comes and goes, you don't get that attachment. But I was kind of aware of that. When they took my kids, you were allowed to go and see them and breastfeed them and all that. And I tried to have as much contact as I could. But the difference was with the third child, he was incredibly healthy when he was born. He was born earlier than the others. And I was hypomanic when I had him. I had him in 25 minutes from start to finish. That was the quickest labour that I'd heard of. And I was so happy. Like, I was just on cloud nine. As soon as he was there, I felt like, oh my God, this is such a chilled out baby. And to be honest, if you look at them as they're adults, it kind of reflects their birth experience. He is still quite a chilled out person. He's got a bit of anxiety, but, you know, I think a lot of people do. But a very easygoing person, a very easygoing baby, and, you know, childhood and all that kind of stuff. So, but again, look, to own what a lot of children with people with mental illness go through. When I went through my court case, my perpetrator got a guilty initially, and I still was so overwhelmed because I was told there would be an appeal and it would be a de novo appeal and I would have to go through the whole thing again. And I was told that within 3 days of the court case verdict. And I immediately had the urge to attempt suicide, and I did. And what actually happened was because it was high profile, it was on the news, and I left the house and I attempted to take my life, and I left a note, and my husband was here and he said he was going down the street for 10 minutes and he would be back. And the children were just all in their rooms doing their stuff. They were ages 16, 13 and 10. What happened was my husband also went through a bit of a breakdown and drove to New South Wales. He was so stressed he had to testify as well as a witness to my behaviour or what I'd said to him. So the kids found that, and that was hugely traumatic for them. And I've always apologised to them and said, I think you'll need help at some point to process this. Now, the oldest child has processed it and talked to me, and he said, I was so angry with you for years, like 6 years or so, and now I'm saddened by what happened. The other two, not so much have they processed it. And so I've, you know, every step of the way I've kind of said to them, if you need to get help, I will help you find, because what I did was an abandonment to you and it wasn't right. And I own that, understand that. So, and I know what it feels like because my own mother did it. But yeah, I mean, it really does affect your kids, and I've always owned that. Whereas my parents, when I kind of said to them, hey, this is what happened when I was a kid, what have you got to say? They just said, you're a difficult child. It's not our fault. You gave us all these things, high blood pressure and alcoholism and everything. And I said, I don't think at 8 years old that was my fault. I'm not prepared to own that. So yeah, just a different dynamic now. I think people are prepared to own what they've done to their kids a bit more.
How'd you go with then trusting people? You had a lot of things happening to you where you would put trust in these people and all this stuff happens to you. How did you go about actually living your life? Because you mentioned a bit about your journey and things into, but like I would personally, how would you trust someone? Like how did you go about functioning?
I didn't really trust anybody, and I really struggled with it. And so it kind of came up when I enrolled my kids into high school, and I thought, all good. And then I'd go to walk into the high school and there was no trust. Like I just thought anybody could hurt these people. And I have tried to explain to them, you need to go by your gut feelings. I don't care if someone's got a working with children's check or whatever, or if they're male or if they're female. I want you to go with your gut feeling. If something doesn't feel right, you know, so they've also grown up with this hyper-vigilant. They never had sleepovers. Probably the last one did, but he really pushed for them. He was not having it. But the other two, they didn't have sleepovers because I didn't trust people. It was really, really difficult. Even probably my husband, we separated after 20 years and we're still in touch because of the kids. And I struggled to even trust him. There's times I don't trust my kids. So trust is a huge thing. I don't trust the medical profession, and I find it really hard to get help, which is why I guess I had been engaged on and off and in and out of psych hospitals my whole life, but they're a place of trauma for me immediately. I become suicidal if I'm forced to go somewhere. So I've made it my mission to manage my own health. And I mean, I still use a psychologist. I use a mental health OT, but I feel a sense of safety because I'm either at home or I'm not in a hospital setting where they can hurt me. So that's where I'm kind of at with trust. It's hard. And even friendships, it's hard if they don't have to do much. And I just think, okay, I've had enough. So yeah.
Fair enough. But I was going to say then, how do you go about healing, or have you gone about healing yourself over the years, or what have you found that's helped you helped you?
So after I had a stint in the last time I was ever in a psych hospital and I was still on antidepressants, I left, but I felt reasonably okay. I felt like I had to give something back and do something in the mental health space to come to terms with never getting can't prove it beyond reasonable doubt. It may have happened. That's with the judge's words. And in both my cases, I had a witness screen the first time I was able to testify well. And in the second case, I didn't have a witness screen. I had to deal with all that anger that I didn't get. It's mandatory to have a witness screen if you ask for one. And to have kind of a shitty judge that didn't allow that, I had to first come to terms with that. So that involved gathering a lot of records, going to the victims commissioner. And then eventually while doing that, I got linked into being I went to a working group for a place-based trial for suicide prevention. Now, I think this was all around Australia, but certainly it was all around Victoria. They were doing place-based trials. And when I went to the first meeting, I think there was like 350 people or something in this room, all different stakeholders and people that were really interested in suicide prevention. At the end of it, there were a few stakeholders and 2 lived experience involved. And I was one of them. And the other one was a man called Rick Corney, who is working in Ballarat at the moment as lived experience. And he is an absolute mentor for me because he's really involved with the same sort of belief that we can do a lot to help ourselves. At the same time, I'd just done Voices for Change through Ballarat Community Health, and that was really good because it was about teaching you how to tell your story and about how you recovered. And obviously recovery for everybody is. I still have bipolar, I still have PTSD, but how I manage it and how, recovery is different for different people. And I actually met Rick White beforehand. He did the group beforehand and he was already doing peer support work and all that kind of stuff. And that kind of piqued my interest and I thought I really want to be a part of this. So I joined the working group for the suicide prevention. And for the next 3 years, I was going to different working groups and working out different ways with other stakeholders and people, and that was with West PHN. And then I was asked to join the leadership group and then the governance group on that. So that was really empowering. I felt like I was actually doing something. And during that time, I became a consumer, joined the Consumer Register for VMIAC, which is the Victorian Mental Illness Awareness Council, and that's the peak body for Victoria's mental health. And sort of at the same time also we were going through the Royal Commission. So I put a submission in and I said, this is what happened. I can't believe how many redactions are in that submission. It's almost impossible to read. But anyway, they redact all the places where you've had abuse or where something's gone wrong, but that's okay. And I also went through the Royal Commission for Sexual Abuse for the institutions that were involved with that as well. So yeah, I guess it was just a part about retelling my story to the community. We spoke to hospital volunteers, uni students, people studying mental health, community service. That went for about a year. The suicide prevention was about 3 years. And then I started to get involved with the recommendations on the Royal Commission, the opportunities for lived experience. And so some of those were working groups, the statewide trauma service, suicide prevention, social prescribing, and then I went on to co-design with social prescribing, working group for eliminating seclusion and restraint. And these things came through VMIAC, but you're working with the Department of Health just to try and improve the mental health system. And lived experience faculties in sexual safety in inpatient units, and that was with Safer Care Vic. And then now I'm one of the tri-chairs. The other 2 chairs are, one of them is with the Department of Health and a carer consultant on the social prescribing initiative in Victoria. So yeah, I feel I'm pretty passionate about social prescribing actually, because I think I was kind of doing it in the way of starting to heal. I was going to art groups and I was just testing the waters I didn't leave my house much after the court case, and I found it hard to connect with people. You lose a lot of friendships when you have bipolar because you do things that are very erratic, or you just have months without speaking to somebody. So I found it really good because I would join an art group or drawing group or just something. I think I did Daughters of the West at one stage, and I just tested the waters with being with other people in these groups. And I found they were fantastic because, and things like Men Shed, that's the social prescribing thing. People go, they don't have to talk that much. They can have a cup of tea at the end and they may only make 1 or 2 connections. But social isolation and loneliness is huge. It's huge amongst youth. It's huge amongst older Victorians. And so, and people with mental health conditions. So I became really really passionate about that. I've done a couple of workshops with CMHL on occupational therapists in relation to lived experience and how sensory reports can be really helpful, because I have an overreaction, I suppose, to noise and lights and that kind of thing. I've worked out how to dull down my PTSD a lot with not going in situations that are going to flare that kind of stuff up. Or if I have to go in them, I've learnt techniques on what to do. So the other things as well that I've used, in 2018, I think it was, maybe 2017, I was diagnosed with a cerebral vasoconstrictive syndrome, which basically meant there was a whole lot of triggers that happened. I would get a thunderclap headache. I would be on the ground and in the worst pain I have ever been in my life. And eventually, after a few of these episodes, I saw a neurologist. He diagnosed me and said, he asked a lot about my history, and he said, have you ever been on antidepressants? And I said, yeah, for about 20 years. And he said, that could be contributing, and you need to go off all SNRIs and SSRIs. So the condition is not particularly common. And I also live in a very cold part of regional Victoria, and I drink coffee, and those things all came together to give me this thunderclap headache. So but it's not unusual. I had quite a few. And he basically said, you can't go back on them. You'll need to either go on something else. Now, older antidepressants are an issue if you've ever had suicidal ideation, because they have a lot of side effects. So I decided I had to go off antidepressants, and I was going to find other ways to manage my mood. And that involved huge amounts of exercise every day. So I swim. In summer, I cycle to a pool. It's outdoors. I'm getting vitamin D. I swim 1.5 kilometres every day. In winter, it's a few times a week. I go bushwalking. I'm a kayaker, so I go kayaking a few times a week when the weather permits. And again, that's not right now in winter. I started practicing mindfulness morning and night, and I would use insight timers so that I could just, if I felt like something longer, I'd do maybe 10 minutes, but 5 minutes was enough. And some of those recordings, there's some on breath work, and they are so good that when I'm extremely anxious, they can bring me down straight away. I started doing creative artistic work like watercolours and ceramics and drawing. I'm not very good at any of it, but it's the process that brings me back into hyper-focus on something that's not my past and it's not the future. It takes me out of anxiety. Yeah, so they're the main things that I tried.
No, I'm glad to hear you mention that. Like, it's everyone says exercise and this and that, but it's very important to hear from people like yourself and Missy where, how it really helps them. And obviously with bipolar, medication can be quite hard, and it's amazing to hear that you do those other things which are always recommended people to do a lot of the time, and to hear that it helps you is fantastic, especially the art stuff. I think the art class stuff, my mum used to do a little bit of it as well, and it was really, what you said is really important. It's just focusing on it in that moment and enjoying that bit of socialization and getting some nice positivity back with it and enjoying it in the moment, not thinking about the future or the past too much. Is a really powerful thing. Art therapy, I think it's a really good thing to do.
Yeah, well, but something I've done this year is crocheting and knitting. And YouTube is amazing because I went to lessons, and when you've got dyscalculia, you cannot follow a pattern. Maybe some people could. I can't follow a pattern. They tried to teach me how to do it. I went to 3 lessons and thought, I cannot do it. And then I thought, no, I'm determined. And I used YouTube, and it was actually yoga is another thing that I've done for years as well, and that's fantastic. I'm quite good friends with my yoga teacher, and her 10-year-old daughter taught me. She said, you need to use thicker wool and thicker needles and you'll be okay. And I tried that and I can do it. Look, I've unpicked it apart many times, but the option is when I'm sitting there watching TV, I'm picking at my nails because I'm an anxious person, and I'm not doing that now. I'm actually doing something that takes my mind away from it. And I got really into it and started knitting as well. I've nearly finished a scarf. So again, it's the process of doing these things that it interests me. It's not the end result. If the end result's okay, that's pretty exciting, but often it's not. But that's okay. And then probably the other thing that I did, so all throughout those times with the CPTSD, I would still have some suicidal ideation. I didn't feel like I was going to act on it, but I still had some suicidal ideation. And then I started looking into mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms, and I tried to get on a trial and I couldn't get on it because I had multiple diagnoses. And I'm not recommending that anybody does this. And I know it's not recommended for bipolar, but at the end of the day, I was worried that I wasn't going to make it to 55 and I needed to do something. So I did 2 years of study into it. I looked at TEDx talks. I looked at ID. I bought about 4 or 5 books. I started reading Bessel van der Kolk. I started reading Nadine Burke-Harris on trauma, Gabor Mate and Johan Hari as well on all these things that were kind of telling me that there were alternate things that I could do. One of the things I did, I got off social media. I'm rarely on it, only if I need to sell something. And I continued just to start looking for these mushrooms. And in that process, I started IDing other mushrooms and taking spore prints, and that was artistic as well. And I found it just all really fascinating. So eventually, when I was ready to try this, I got my own mushrooms, and I wish I'd had somebody to be able to be there with me. It's a goal, but I didn't have anybody, so I did this by myself, had to wait till all my family was out. Probably not the ideal way, but I did have a psychologist session the next day each time I did it. And I did this in 2022 and 2023. I had 3 sessions. In each experience, I went back to New Haven each time and had these profound experiences. I was watching things that were happening to me, but I was watching as an adult what happened to me as a child, and it wasn't distressing at all. It gave me new insight into what was happening, and I ended up not having suicidal thoughts again pretty much the 3rd time. Each time I would feel different. In that week after, it was almost like my mind was doing something. I wasn't sure what. I think it's reconnecting or something. I'd talk about the whole experience with the psychologist, and I haven't felt any urge to try it again. It wasn't pleasant, but it really helped me.
Yeah, it's amazing to hear all the new stuff that's going on around there, and hopefully all the stiffs who make those decisions and really open their mind a bit to it. And it's good. I know there's obviously trials and stuff they're doing, and hopefully that, and it's glad to hear that it was very beneficial for you, because you've got to try something. And I think the hard thing is, like, you go through all what you've gone through, and then, you know, you're told to then go to it'd be so hard to go see a psychiatrist or a psychologist, or even to go to any of those places at all. And like, how do you get help? So you've sort of, as you said, you've got to take, you took a bit of ownership, or you've taken ownership over trying things and doing things. And, you know, what works for you is obviously proven to work, which is fantastic.
Yeah, and what I liked about it was that I didn't have to continue doing it. I mean, I didn't really have an issue with IDing them and finding them, but I definitely had an issue with measuring them out, because I can't even read numbers very well. So that was a bit of an issue. But, you know, at the end of the day, what frustrates me is they've given this to psychiatrists to manage.
Yep.
Psychiatrists have never known a huge amount about trauma, and perhaps that's changing. I don't know. But yeah.
I'd say it's not. You know, I dealt with them probably a while ago. It's just, I still think they're very, very old school on what they do. I don't think much has changed, and even in 40 years, they might say otherwise. They probably will say otherwise, but I don't think it has, to be honest. It's just different types of drugs they're using, really. Like, what else is there that's been sort of revolutionary from their perspective? From, I don't know, you know a lot more about it than me from with it, but what have you seen maybe then as an improvement? Because you've obviously been in the system at probably it's one of its most brutal times back in the 70s and 80s, and then how it is now.
It's definitely changed. So, I mean, I came pretty close to having to have ECT, but I had a psychiatrist in a mother-baby unit, which a mother-baby unit's way different to a psych hospital, who could see that I'd experienced trauma, and she tried to get to the root cause of it. She tried FOIing records and everything, but for whatever reason, she couldn't get what she needed. And I wasn't saying I was abused. I said nothing. I didn't say anything until I was in my 40s to anybody. And I just feel like a lot of psychiatrists, they rely on people remaining unwell, or they don't have a career, and they don't, I don't know. I remember probably not that long ago, probably 6 or 8 years ago, I had quite a nice psychiatrist as an inpatient, and he said, and I really wanted to go for a walk. I just wanted to walk around the block. And it was that thing where I was involuntary. So most of the times I'm involuntary. I'm rarely voluntary. And he said, okay, I'll let you go, because there's been this new research that if you go walking, it helps your mental health. And I thought, did you not? I knew that 20 years ago. How come you only just know that now? I feel better after I exercise. So that was just, but you have to suck up to them and say, oh, really? I didn't know that, because
yeah, you have to activate with them. You're right when saying that. You have to activate with them. You know,
otherwise you'll lose your privilege.
Yes.
So
you're right.
It's kind of that. And I don't think anything turned me more off having ECT, because they wanted to do ECT than going and seeing the ECT area. And I just thought, that's definitely not encouraging me to.
The ECT was very horrible. Yeah, not a good thing. And not a good thing for your kids to see. Like if you have ECT and the kids going in visit you, it's not a good thing to see at all. It's just sort of a quick fix to try, and they don't know why it works, but they know that it does something to get in, then to get you back out and about. But I was going to say as well, accountability, because I get real angry hearing this stuff, because obviously these government institutions at the time, where's the accountability been for these? You hear about, churches and all that sort of stuff, and there's obviously been a lot of, exposés and content around that sort of, but I haven't heard overly much about the psychiatric care. And this, what you have said, would have been not an isolated experience, would have been, I presume, quite rampant back in the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what accountability has there been? Because why isn't this a bigger deal? Like when I hear this, you think, bloody hell, like why isn't this a bigger deal than what it is? Or why hasn't it got the mainstream attention in the media with it? Or has it? I watched it. I will try and stay up there with a lot of things, and I haven't seen this made into much of a thing at all.
I feel like it's because they can say that you are not rational, and essentially they can wipe it out. And I've seen this happen. I've been an inpatient where one of the residents was let out every day, and he took ice every day, and he would come back quite psychotic. And there was another resident there who was also psychotic. And I want to say that when most people, when they're psychotic, they're actually quite harmless. It is rare that someone's going to become violent when they're psychotic. And, they might be walking around talking to themselves or talking to people that we can't see, but they're not hurting us. Yeah. And this person had been talking to himself for quite a while, and each time this other person would come back in, he took offence to him and he would attack him, like full-on attack him. Now, it took, I think, the third attack, and each time he attacked, he'd be dragged to seclusion for 24 hours. Not an ideal situation for any of them. And so this other guy, eventually he got taken from MRI and brought back. And I remember sitting there and I saw a nurse walk up to him. He must have been due for release. And she said, you can't go to the police right now about what's happened. You can't. But I will be your witness when you get out, because they won't listen to you right now. And I thought, so essentially, and also like the dialogue of when sexual abuse happens within a psych hospital or not a psych hospital, but just if you've got a psych condition, it's one of the first things you're asked. Do you have a psychiatric condition? Yep. It's almost like the police understand that people with psychiatric conditions are going to be abused, but it's harder to prove a case if someone has a psychiatric issue, because the defence is going to pull you apart and say, look at the young lady who suicided with one of the politicians. She had bipolar and CPTSD, I think. And there was, in the comments in Facebook and all sorts of things, there was like, oh yeah, but she had these mental health issues, so how do you even know it's true? And I think, do they have any idea that people can still be quite rational, and you have eurythmic episodes when you have bipolar, It almost feels like nothing is allowed to happen to someone with a mental health condition where you can safely report it without having your background absolutely scrutinised. Yeah,
you were spot on, Sue. And I remember I used to hear, it was hard for me growing, because my mum used to say a lot of things about what nurses were doing to her or other people and stuff, and you didn't know what to believe, because they're in the mum was in involuntary and had ECT and stuff. But you're right, and it's a tough one, because you have people who might have delusions about stuff, but you have, as you said, these experiences and stuff which go on and were quite rampant, and then people have this cover of, they've got a mental health condition, so we can't believe them at all, which is a joke. And it's like the nursing homes, for example. People suspect their parents being abused in a nursing home or whatever, and everyone decides with the nursing home and stuff, and it takes them putting a camera in the room or something like that for anything to be actually done. So I think the dismissal by police and stuff just blindly is quite ridiculous. And I'm hoping, hearing what you've said is quite heartbreaking, but just to hear how there hasn't been the accountability for these places, and these people must be still around, a bit older now, but they still must be held accountable. It's just amazing that it hasn't been more of a spotlight thrown into it. And I think, as you said, quite rightly, is that because it's people with mental illnesses, that they're just, everything they say is going to be treated as a lie, which I think is an absolute joke. Well, the other thing too is, and this came out a couple of years ago, or maybe last year, by the lawyer advocate Simon Catterall, pointed out that the MHCC, which I know they've changed their name now and some things have slightly changed, had, I think it was over 27,000 complaints, and not one of those complaints by consumers or carers about psychiatric hospitals, not one had been actioned. Really? Yeah, there'd been no follow through. Now, I had to deal with the MHCC myself. I ended up back in as a inpatient in my area, and I was taken to a
area that I wasn't really familiar with, but it was right near seclusion. And I had a youth come up to me and say, I can rape you at any time. And I just thought, I'm 40 something, so I don't think I'm very appealing for that. And I kind of dismissed it. And then he said it again and he came back with another person. And I freaked out, I freaked out. And I went to the nurse's station and said, can I speak to my CASA worker? That's CASA's the Centre Against Sexual Assault. And I had an ongoing worker there. And they're also under the banner of this hospital. So I said, I need to speak to my CASA worker. I'm terrified. I need to be put somewhere else. Now, rather than dealing with the situation, putting me in a room and him somewhere else, they dragged me to seclusion. They put me in seclusion overnight. So I went through this it was a few years later that I realised that was wrong. And I complained to them and they ignored it. And I went to the MHCC. And 2 years later, before I got an apology, and I had to push it. And in the meeting we finally had with the head of the psych hospital, the deputy director, the director, deputy director, and somebody else, the MHCC said before it went to them, you can't talk about the seclusion. And I thought, you try and stop me. I'm talking about the seclusion. And I told them, and they apologised to me. You know, I think they think if they apologise, everyone's going to sue. I haven't sued. Sometimes an apology is really empowering because it does make them slightly accountable and they change their ways, you know.
Has there been a case that you know of or you can refer to that's been actually got some media attention and been prosecuted around this stuff where there's things like maybe in the 80s or 70s or 90s, has someone actually gone to court and won a settlement or held someone accountable, or has there been anything like that at all?
Not that I know of. No. Yeah. I have heard of particular people that have worked within the mental health sector and they've not dealt with, for example, rape from other patients to that person well, and it hasn't been reported well to the parents. I know of one of those cases, but I also know the person that didn't deal with it well, he just moved to another hospital. So people, they just move around, and this happens, the higher they are up the level, they just get moved somewhere else, or they move around and they make a mistake and nothing actually happens for the person. So possibly those things happen civilly, and there are civil cases where they're sued. But I guess when it's mental health, what they do try to prove, and I only know this because I know survivors in the Catholic system who are civilly sued, they will do anything to prove that you are mentally unstable and that your word in court is not correct because of your instability. Now, I don't know any sexual abuse survivors that don't have a mental health condition, a substance abuse condition, or an eating disorder condition. I don't know anybody who has never been through something, because that's what it causes. That's how your mind copes with it. Yeah.
And the lawyer in your legal process is quite full on. There's a few documentaries, obviously, on TV about, you know, the church sexual abuse and what the young kids at the time now, you know, 50s and 60s had to go through with the court process, and, you know, it's just who would put themselves through that. And I think, you know, like what you're saying, like, makes heaps of sense that would have happened to a lot of people in the psychiatric wards. And the thing I sort of hear now is like, you know, well, no one knew any better back then, but that's not an excuse. It hasn't been an excuse for the churches, hasn't been an excuse for a lot of different institutions. So it's amazing how this hasn't got any coverage, or I understand why, because obviously how brave do you have to be to go through the whole thing again and try and have your character and all that question, you know, and then have a lawyer trying to rip you apart, you know, because you've got a mental health condition. Like, it's not something that's easy for anyone to do, but also people shouldn't get away with what they've done. And I think there's a lot of people who are probably still out there living, you know, and they're maybe in their 70s or 80s who know what they've done and they'll never be held account.
Yeah, that's right. And the other thing in court that comes up a lot, and this came up with, I think, one of the high-profile Catholic cases victims who died, is that, you know, they had a substance abuse issue. That comes up and they just say that. And it's like, do you not see the link between why someone would have a substance abuse issue, why someone would not take heroin to block out the trauma that's happened to them? You know, like, it's really common and it shouldn't be used. I don't know if judges need to be educated a bit better. I mean, certainly in my case,
I definitely think they do be, because I think they're getting a bit of the under the microscope now at that bail warrant, the young person who killed the guy whilst they on bail. I think finally judges seem to avoid all scrutiny, to be honest, and they go, well, we've got the appeals and all that sort of stuff, but I think they just look after themselves, quite frankly. And I think you're right. I don't think they're educated enough, nor do I think they have enough empathy, because it's a tough job what they do, and there's sentencing guidelines and all that sort of stuff. But I do think the judicial process has zero empathy. People like yourself.
I know. Well, look, the first case that I had, that was the initial case, the judge was amazing, and I wanted a witness protection screen, and the defence lawyer kept trying to get me. He said, I can't see her properly. He kept trying to get me to move that screen. So the idea of a witness protection screen is that the defence lawyer can see you, but the perpetrator can't.
Yeah.
Can't. And so this whole time he was trying to get me to move the screen or move over a bit. And during that time, that person would lean forward to try and get sight of me. Now, the reason they do that is to unstabilize you, to get you anxious so you can't tell. Yeah, and I knew that was happening and I didn't fall for it. But with the second case, the judge just said, this is my courtroom. I'm not having a witness screen. If this person doesn't want to testify remotely, then they're not having one. And I didn't want to testify remotely because I felt if I was in a room by myself with a whole lot of equipment, I would disassociate quite severely because I wouldn't feel safe. And so as soon as they took away that screen, I definitely didn't feel safe. And a sense of safety is really important to a trauma survivor. So that person had basically won as soon as they did that, which of course the defence lawyer would have known. Yeah, but I did just want to add a saying from Gabor Mate, the trauma expert, and it's basically trauma is not, this is a quote from him, it's trauma is not what happens, not what happens to you. It's what happens inside of you as a result of what happens to you, which is absolutely true. You know, like you have a sexual assault, you physically heal with no problems, but how your mind results from that is what the problem is. It's not the actual incident. I mean, I was in a really bad typhoon when I was 3 years old, and a lot of people died. It was in Hong Kong. And I have no stress from that at all. It would have been a big trauma, but I'm not traumatized really at all. I don't like wind much, but that's the difference. It was handled really well. My parents didn't go into it too much, and I just had a normal, went to sleep afterwards, had a normal, reaction. But when you're going through sexual abuse and you're a teenager and you're not telling anybody, my parents weren't people I could approach to tell. They weren't supportive. So yeah, it's completely different. Your mind, it just takes it quite differently.
Well, is there anything else on your notes there, Sue? You've got to the effort of writing them. I would like, hope not miss anything for you've written down.
Well, the other quote I wanted to write, and I heard this a couple of weeks ago at a social prescribing conference in Sydney. It's by Robert Putnam, who wrote Bowling Alone, and he also wrote Join or Die. And this is a guy, he's an academic who's done research from 1970 to now and written up why we don't join as many clubs, why we're not as socially connected, even though digitally we are. And he basically has come up with, if you join just one group-based activity, you will halve your chance of dying within the next year. And I feel like that's really powerful, particularly for people who are older or isolated. Just one group may help you. There's a lot of dynamics as to why that occurs, but that's one of my quotes. And I also just wanted to add some of the changes that I would love to see in mental health systems not mental health systems, but just in general, is that we have all schools with year 11 and 12 teaching mental health first aid and suicide prevention, because the youth is a high cohort for that, and all medical schools teaching mental health first aid, because as far as I know, there's only one that teaches that, and doctors go through a very brief stint through a psych hospital where they're seeing the most severe illnesses. They're not seeing your anxiety and depression and things that are causing people massive issues every day. And more funding to neighbourhood houses to assist with social connection, because those places are amazing. They're really, and I don't think they get enough funding.
Yeah, no, the community living sort of stuff. I know a guy called Bill Campus. I've had him on before, and he does Independent Living Australia, and they have those independent community living, and they have a lot of those houses as well, and that's really, really important for people. And I think, as you said, the groups and the connection thing is really, really important. And even though, as you said, we're more connected, but we've probably more isolated than ever. But you mentioned the men's shed, which I know I've got a bit to do with the men's shed with my work, and we've gone and filmed some stuff there. And yeah, it's just fantastic to see. And it's interesting, like you see blokes there who won't say one word to anyone, but but you know that that's their one thing for the week. And if they didn't have that one thing for the week, they'd just be sitting in their home by themselves doing nothing. And even though they're not saying anything to anyone, being around people and building things and whatever, that activity is really, really ultra important. And, we put all this money in other areas, but those sorts of areas, as you said, the community stuff is really, really important and can have a massive effect on someone.
Yeah, it really does. And some of those people, and I see these guys when I swim in the outdoor pool, older guys that come along and they go for their swim, and afterwards they have just a bit of a chat or maybe a cup of coffee with some people that they don't know that well, but they're doing it every couple of days.
Yeah.
And that might be, they might then go home to their wife and just, plod along, they're retired. And I just think it's hugely important. And when governments shut places like this, like outdoor pools, or don't give enough funding for them, they don't have any idea of the impact, because there's physical and mental health issues as people start to decline. And that person you suggested that's going to the, you mentioned that going to the men's shed, he may never talk, but he might not come one week and become really sick. And the other men will start sort of saying, oh, we better ring up or just check up on him. And it's that social connection that helps people stay alive, really.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. It's a part of suicide prevention, even if you don't say specifically suicide prevention or anything, but it does form a part of it for sure. Well, thank you very much for sharing your story. Amazing story you've been able to share, and so honest. It's so raw, and there's a lot of mental health content now, but what you just shared then, like for me, it's so invaluable to people, because it's stuff that people don't talk about. They don't want to talk about it. And for you to be very brave and to share that, and to still be here after all this trauma you've experienced, and to have a family and stuff, is just an amazing achievement. So thank you very much for sharing your story today and reaching out. Need more people like you to do it, because it's this is the type of content that politicians and people really need to hear, because it's the real stuff. That's what happens. So it's not just depression and anxiety, which people see with a sport athlete or something every now and again. It's stuff like this. So thank you very much for taking the time to share that today.
That's all right. Thanks for having me on, Joel.
Cool. Thanks, Sue.